In a warehouse at the port of Lorenzo Marques, a slave trader found a name in his records that made him go pale. For 3 weeks, he had kept, fed, and finally sold as a simple prisoner of war, a man whose skin carried the ritual scars of the Zulu royal line. When he realized what he had done, it was already too late. The ship had already sailed, and in the hills it was said that Zulu warriors were searching for their missing prince. If this story already catches your interest, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. Your support helps us continue to uncover these forgotten stories from history. The story I am about to share is about a man who believed he had mastered his trade better than anyone, who thought he knew the value of every human being he bought and sold. A careful, well-organized man who kept detailed records of every deal. But in his pride, he had never imagined that one day, among the hundreds of unknown faces passing through his hands, there would be someone whose disappearance could start a war. Someone whose blood carried a weight that neither chains nor whips could erase. The Bay of Lorenzo Marques on the east coast of Africa lived in constant tension at that time. It was the mid-19th century, a period when European empires tightened their control over the continent, where old Arab trade routes crossed paths with Portuguese, British, and Dutch ambitions. The official transatlantic slave trade was coming to an end in most Western countries. But here in these warm waters where Arab dhows sailed beside Portuguese caravels, the trade continued under different names: labor contracts, forced recruitment, deportation of prisoners of war. The words changed, but the reality stayed the same. The region was a dangerous meeting point where cultures, languages, and conflicting interests mixed together. To the north, the powerful Zulu Empire strengthened its territory after the devastating Fikane Wars. This time of unrest had reshaped the political map of southern Africa. To the south, the British colonies of the Cape and Natal expanded steadily. Between them lay a gray zone where merchants, adventurers, deserters, and opportunists of all kinds operated. It was in this setting that William Vanderburg had built his business. Of Dutch origin, he had left the Cape Colony 20 years earlier, after a scandal no one spoke about anymore. He settled in Lorenzo Marques under Portuguese protection, getting the needed licenses through generous bribes and connections with corrupt officials. His warehouse, a large stone building near the port, worked as a transit point for hundreds of captives each year. Vanderburg did not see himself as a slave trader. He saw himself as a businessman, a necessary middleman in a changing world. He bought prisoners of war from local chiefs, debtors who could not pay, criminals, and orphans. He sold them to sugar plantations in Mauritius, to diamond mines that were starting to open inland, and to landowners in Brazil who avoided abolition laws. He kept clean records, paid his taxes, and stayed away from political trouble. In his mind, he was only one part of a larger economic system. The warehouse itself showed this organized and bureaucratic vision of horror. On the ground floor, a row of cells where captives waited for inspection, evaluation, and sale. Upstairs were Vanderburg's offices with carefully written ledgers, contracts in many languages, and sea charts showing trade routes. In the inner courtyard, there was a forge where chains were made, a well, and a kitchen where corn and cassava porridge, the prisoner's only daily meal, was prepared. Vanderburg employed about 15 men, mostly armed guards, Portuguese and African workers, hard men, who asked no questions. A foreman named Joe Santos, a former soldier, handled daily operations with harsh efficiency. A clerk, a man named Rule, helped Vanderburg keep records, and a wide network of informants kept him aware of buying chances, troop movements, and rumors from inland. Every Wednesday, Vanderburg arranged an auction for regular buyers, planters, ship captains, and mining agents. Deals were made quickly and professionally, with handshakes and signatures on legal papers. No one spoke of slaves. They used terms like contract laborers, African workforce, or deportees. These softer words allowed people to feel less guilty. The man who ran this business was methodical almost to obsession. In his late 50s, his face worn by the African sun, his graying hair tied back, Vandenberg always wore neat clothes despite the heat, a white shirt, dark vest, and canvas trousers. He did not drink, gamble, or visit the port taverns. He lived alone in a simple house near the warehouse, giving every waking hour to his work. But behind this image of order and respect, Vandenberg carried a quiet fear. He knew his work depended on a fragile balance. Too much attention from British authorities could bring charges of illegal trade. Too much cruelty toward captives could lead to revolts. Too much carelessness in choosing his products could damage his reputation. He walked a narrow line, and he knew it. This fear pushed him to be extremely careful in his methods. Every new captive was medically checked to avoid spreading disease in the warehouse. Every deal was recorded with a name, supposed origin, buying price, and selling price. Vandenberg even kept rough sketches of tribal marks or unique scars in case questions came later. This record-keeping, he believed, protected him. It showed that he followed the rules, however twisted they were. It was in early March, 1847, that a strange group arrived at the warehouse. Vandenberg had been expecting them. 2 weeks earlier, an intermediary named Ferrer had told him about a rare opportunity. A group of Portuguese and African slave hunters had captured several Zulu warriors during the raid near the Natal border. 23 men, all young, all in excellent physical shape. High-quality captives who would sell for a very good price. Vandenberg agreed to the deal after some negotiation. The price was high but fair. Zulu warriors were known for strength and endurance. They would make strong workers in plantations or mines. He had paid in advance, as Ferrer demanded, and waited for the arrival of the human cargo. When the captives were brought into the courtyard, chained and worn out after days of forced marching, Vandenberg examined them with his usual professional eye. They matched the description: young, strong, marked with the typical scars of Zulu warriors. Some had fresh wounds that showed the violence of their capture. All of them showed defiance and controlled anger. Vandenberg especially noticed one man, taller than the rest, likely in his 30s, with a presence that naturally drew attention. His body had more detailed ritual scars than the others. Geometric shapes on his shoulders, straight lines across his torso. His eyes were different too. No fear, not even clear anger. Something deeper, colder, a quiet certainty. That one, is he their leader? Vandenberg asked Ferrer in Portuguese. The intermediary shrugged. Maybe a war captain. They called him something like Inkosi during the journey, but they call many of their leaders that. It means chief or lord in their language. Vandenberg nodded. The title did not worry him. In Zulu military systems, there were many ranks and titles. Each group had its commanders. This man was likely a minor officer, nothing more. He might sell for a little more. That was all. The 23 men were locked in a separate part of the warehouse. Vandenberg gave strict orders to Santos. These captives were dangerous, trained fighters since childhood. Double guards at night. No more than 5 allowed together in the courtyard at any time. Constant watch. Chains had to be checked twice daily. In the following days, Vandenberg noticed that the group behaved differently from other captives. They did not complain, beg, or try to speak with the guards. They stayed silent and composed, as if waiting for something. The tall warrior with the marked scars seemed to be the center of this quiet discipline. When he looked at someone, the others followed. When he took food, the others ate. It was subtle, but clear to anyone paying attention. Joe Santos noticed it too. These Zulus are not like the others, boss. They make the guards uneasy. They don't do anything wrong, but the way they look at us, it feels like they're waiting for the right moment. Vandenberg brushed off the Nern. They are chained, unarmed, and weakened. What can they do? In a few weeks, they will be spread across the ocean. Just keep watching them until they sail. Still, something about the situation disturbed him. It was slight, almost unnoticeable. A tension in the air, something strange in the silence of these men. Vanderberg had seen hundreds of captives pass through his warehouse, broken men, angry men, hopeless men, but never this calm patience, this perfect discipline. It was as if they were not truly prisoners in their minds, as if they were waiting for the right moment. The sale was set for the following Wednesday. Vanderberg already had interested buyers. A plantation owner from Mauritius wanted around 20 strong laborers. A mining agent needed a dozen men for new excavations near Kimberley. The Zulu warriors would be separated and sent to far places where their unity would no longer matter. On Tuesday evening, the day before the sale, Vanderberg made his usual inspection of the warehouse. He preferred to personally check that everything was ready before an important deal. He moved past the cells, writing down names in his ledger, and made sure the guards were standing at their posts. When he reached the section where the Zulu warriors were held, he paused. The tall man with the detailed scars stood near the bars, even at that late hour, and their eyes locked. The man spoke in a blend of Zulu and a few Portuguese words he must have picked up during captivity. "You sell, man, you do not know who you sell." His voice was steady, with no clear threat, yet something in his tone sent a chill down Vanderberg's spine. There was a deep certainty in those words, almost like a prophecy. Vanderberg answered in Portuguese, knowing the man might not understand everything. "I know exactly what I am doing. You are prisoners of war. It is legal. Tomorrow you will have new masters, and this matter will be finished." The man kept staring at him. Then he spoke again, in Zulu, a long and complicated sentence. Vanderberg understood nothing, but the tone sounded like a formal declaration. Around the tall warrior, his companions had stood up and remained still, like silent witnesses to an important moment. Vanderberg turned away, feeling uneasy. He told himself it was foolish to feel threatened by a chained prisoner, but as he walked back to his office, he could not shake off a quiet discomfort. Something felt wrong, though he could not explain it. That night, he found it hard to sleep. In his broken dreams, he saw groups of Zulu warriors with oval shields and short spears moving in perfect lines toward his warehouse. He woke up many times in sweat, thinking he could hear distant war drums. On Wednesday morning, the sale went ahead as planned. Buyers came on time, inspected the captives, and bargained over prices. The 23 Zulu warriors were divided among 3 different buyers. The tall man with the detailed scars was purchased by a ship captain named Henderson, a Briton who often transported contract workers to the sugar plantations of Mauritius. 8 of his companions left with him. The rest were split between a landowner and a mining company agent. Vanderberg collected the payments, signed transfer papers, and recorded everything in his ledgers. Transaction number 347 for the year. Everything seemed correct. The buyers left with their purchases, and Captain Henderson's ship was set to sail that evening to catch the tide. In his office, Vanderberg counted his earnings. The deal had been very profitable. The selling price was much higher than the purchase cost, even after detention and food expenses. He carefully wrote the details in his large, leather-bound ledger. Names of buyers, number of captives, amounts. Next to the tall warrior's end, he simply wrote, "Zulu captive, ritual scar marks, about 30 years old, sold to Henderson for transport to Mauritius." As evening came, Vanderberg allowed himself a glass of port, something he rarely did. He felt a sense of relief. This deal had made him uneasy in a way he could not explain, but now it was over. The Zulu warriors were gone. Henderson's ship was sailing east. In a few days, the men would be scattered across different plantations, and their unity would be broken forever. He did not know that at that same moment, more than 300 kilometers to the south, an entire group of Zulu warriors had begun gathering near the Natal border. Messengers ran between kraals carrying urgent news. An important man had gone missing, a man of royal blood, and rumors spread that he had been seen among chained captives taken north toward Lorenzo Qua. The first news reached Vanderberg a week later, but he ignored it. One of his informants, a traitor, who often traveled inland, casually mentioned unusual activity among the Zulus, troop movements, gatherings, but this was not uncommon. The informant said the Zulus were always fighting someone, whether the British, the Boers, or other African tribes. Vanderberg gave it no further thought. He was busy with a new shipment of captives, women and children taken during a raid on an inland village. He handled logistics, arranged the next sale, and wrote to potential buyers. But João Santos, his foreman, seemed worried. He came to see Vanderberg one morning, 2 weeks after the sale of the Zulu warriors. "Boss, the guards are talking. There are strange rumors at the port." Vanderberg looked up from his ledger. "What kind of rumors?" "They say the Zulus are searching for someone, one of their war chiefs, or maybe a prince. He was said to have been captured by slave hunters about a month ago. The Zulus are questioning all merchants and transporters. They are offering a reward for information." Vanderberg felt a cold chill run through him. "A prince? That is impossible. Zulu princes do not wander alone in the bush to be captured." João shrugged. "That is what people are saying. It seems there was a dispute within the royal family. This prince or chief had gone into exile with a group of loyal warriors as a matter of honor. But now the political situation has changed. He is needed for talks with the British. When they tried to call him back, they found he had vanished." Vanderberg stood up quickly. "Wait, how many men were with him?" "The rumors say between 20 and 25 warriors." Vanderberg's blood turned cold. 23. He had bought 23 Zulu warriors. He rushed to his ledger, flipping through the pages until he found the entry. There it was, written in his own hand. 23 Zulu captives bought from Farah, March 1st. He read his notes again. Nothing seemed unusual, except for the remark about the tall warrior with the detailed scars. Scars. Vanderberg was not an expert in Zulu markings, but he knew some patterns were meant for nobility, for certain bloodlines. "I need more information," he told João. "Find out everything you can about this story. Names, descriptions, everything. And most importantly, find out if anyone has mentioned my name to the Zulus." In the days that followed, Vanderberg lived in fear. He continued his routine, but part of his mind kept returning to the same terrible thought. What if it was true? What if he had sold a member of the Zulu royal family? He tried to calm himself. Even if it were true, what danger was there? The Zulus could not reach him here under Portuguese protection, and the man was already far away, on his way to Mauritius, impossible to recover. The matter should have been finished, but deep down, Vanderberg knew that nothing in Africa was ever truly finished. Grudges lasted for generations. Blood debts were never forgotten, and the Zulus were known for their long memory and strong sense of justice. João returned a week later with clearer information. He had spoken to several sources, compared stories, and the picture that formed was alarming. The man Vanderberg had sold was named Makunda. He was a younger son of the former Zulu king, a half-brother of the current ruler. He was not directly in line for the throne, but his blood was royal. A few years earlier, during a difficult succession conflict, Makunda had chosen exile instead of joining a civil war. He had left with his loyal followers, about 20 skilled warriors, and settled in a border area, living by hunting and small raids. But recently, things had changed. The British were increasing pressure on the Zulu kingdom. Important negotiations were taking place. The king needed all key members of the royal family to show unity against European forces. Messengers had been sent to bring Makunda back. When they reached his camp, it was empty. There were signs of struggle, abandoned weapons, and evidence of a sudden attack. Following the trail, they found witnesses in nearby villages. A group of slave hunters, likely Portuguese and African, had captured Makunda and his men in a night ambush. The captives were taken north. Since then, the Zulus had been searching. Warriors followed the trail, spies questioned merchants, and a large reward was offered. But the trail disappeared near the coast. Boss João said in a serious voice, "If this is really the prince you sold, then we have a problem, a very big problem." Vanderberg stayed silent for a long moment. Then he asked, Ferrer. Where is Ferrer? Gone. No one has seen him since the deal. He left Lorenzo Marquez the day after delivering the captives. Vanderberg cursed. Ferrer had known. He had known who the captives were, which is why he demanded quick payment and then vanished. He had passed the problem to Vanderberg, who now had to deal with the consequences. And Henderson, Vanderberg asked, "The captain who bought Makanda? His ship reached Mauritius 10 days ago. The captives were unloaded and sold at auction there. Makanda was bought by a plantation owner named Dusa, who owns a large estate in the northern part of the island." Vanderberg put his head in his hands. The situation was worse than he thought. Makanda was not just far away. He was on an island, on a plantation, likely under a different name, almost impossible to find without a deep search. And even if someone found him, how could he be freed? The owner had legal papers proving the purchase. It would require complex legal steps, or even violence. In the following days, Vanderberg tried to act normal, but he barely slept. Every sound at night made him jump. Every stranger who came to the warehouse seemed like a threat. He increased the guards, installed stronger locks, and even began thinking about moving his business to another city. Then one morning, something unusual happened. A man arrived at the warehouse asking to meet Vanderberg. He was tall, dark-skinned, dressed in a mix of European and African clothing. He spoke perfect Portuguese with a strange accent. "Mr. Vanderberg, I come on behalf of people who are interested in certain transactions you have recently made." Vanderberg received him in his office, his hand resting on the loaded pistol he now kept constantly inside a drawer. "What transaction are you referring to?" The man smiled slightly. "Let's not play this game. You already know very well what I mean. The group of Zulu warriors you purchased in March. 23 men. One of them had clear scars across his shoulders and torso." Vanderberg said nothing, waiting for more details. "My employers would like to know where this man." I bared. "Now, they are ready to pay generously for this information and for your silence about this entire matter. Who are your employers?" The man gave a small shrug. "People who prefer to stay unknown. Let's just say they have a personal interest in the safety of this individual." Vanderberg understood at once this was an agent, probably working for the Zulu kingdom, or maybe British or Portuguese, intermediaries playing their own game in this situation. The important thing was that they were offering money and the promise of discretion. Vanderberg hesitated. He could give the information, take the money, and hope everything would end without further trouble. Or he could lie, refuse, and hope the issue would disappear by itself. This man was sold to a British ship captain named Henderson. The ship left for Mauritius. I know nothing more. The agent nodded slowly. "Mauritius, that's a beginning. Do you have any other details? A plantation name, a specific buyer?" Vanderberg shook his head. "Henderson resold his captives at auction in Mauritius. I have no way of knowing who bought them afterward. It was a lie." Vanderberg kept regular contact with several merchants in Mauritius. He could get the information if he wanted, but something stopped him from saying too much. The agent placed a heavy purse on the desk. "For your cooperation so far. If you learn anything else, inform me." He left an address, a warehouse near the port. After he left, Vanderberg opened the purse. Gold. A large amount of gold, more than he earned in a full month of normal business. But this money felt bitter. It was the price of his involvement in something far bigger than him. In the weeks that followed, Vanderberg tried quietly to gather more information about Makanda's fate. He wrote to contacts in Mauritius under business excuses, asking harmless questions about recent auctions and new arrivals of laborers. The replies he received unsettled him. Yes, a group of Zulu laborers had arrived on Henderson's ship in early April. They were sold quickly because the Zulus had a strong reputation. A tall man with noticeable scars had been bought by Armand Dusa, owner of one of the island's largest sugar plantations. Dusa had paid a high price for him, as the man seemed strong and healthy despite the long journey. But there was more. Several letters mentioned incidents at Deuce's plantation. Nothing very clear, but rumors were spreading. One of the new Zulu laborers was causing trouble, not open rebellion, but a spirit of defiance and influence over the other workers. Deuce had increased security, separating certain captives to break their connections. Vanderberg understood that Makanda was not submitting. Even in chains, even enslaved, he kept his dignity and natural authority. It was both admirable and frightening. A man like that could not be broken by simple force. He had to be broken mentally or spiritually, or he would eventually create serious problems. In July 1847, 4 months after the sale, Vanderberg received another visit. This time it was not the mysterious agent, but a British officer in uniform with 2 soldiers. Major Thornton, responsible for relations with indigenous tribes for the colonial government of Natal, had very specific questions about a group of Zulu warriors who had passed through Vanderberg's warehouse. "We have reason to believe," said Thornton with cold professionalism, "that an individual of great political importance was illegally captured and sold as a slave. This matter could have serious diplomatic consequences. The Zulu kingdom is threatening retaliation if their prince is not found and released." Vanderberg felt sweat forming on his forehead. "Major, I run a legal business. I do not ask questions about the identity of my contract laborers. I receive war captives. I resell them. Everything is recorded." Thornton fixed Vanderberg with a hard stare. "War captives." Thornton fixed Vanderberg. "You use that term very easily. Tell me, did you confirm that these men were truly prisoners of war, or did you simply ignore the truth because it was profitable?" Vanderberg did not answer. Both men knew the question needed no reply. "Where is this man now?" Thornton asked. "In Mauritius, sold to a plantation owner named Deuce." Thornton wrote down the information. Documentary proof. Vanderberg brought out his ledgers and showed the entries, date, name, amount, everything clearly written. Proof of his administrative involvement, but also of his use of legal procedures that protected him. "These documents will be taken as evidence," Thornton said, "and I strongly advise you, Mr. Vanderberg, to cooperate fully with any future investigation. The British and Portuguese governments are taking this matter very seriously. If this Zulu prince dies in captivity, or if we cannot find him quickly, the consequences could be severe for everyone." After the British left, Vanderberg collapsed into his chair. The situation was moving completely beyond his control. What had started as a simple business deal was turning into an international crisis. The Zulus wanted their prince. The British wanted to avoid war. The Portuguese wanted no conflict with the British. And he, Vanderberg, was trapped in the middle. He realized he had to act. If he did nothing, he would become the scapegoat for the whole affair. He would be blamed for causing a diplomatic crisis. His business would be ruined, and he might even be arrested. Vanderberg wrote a long letter to Deuce in Mauritius. He explained the situation as carefully as possible. The man Deuce had bought was not just a laborer. He was a member of the Zulu royal family. His illegal captivity was creating serious diplomatic tension. Siana Vanderberg begged Deuce to release the man and hand him over to the British authorities, who would arrange his return. In exchange, Vanderberg offered to repay the purchase price along with generous compensation for the trouble caused. It was a huge amount, equal to several months of profit, but Vanderberg was desperate. Deuce's reply arrived 3 weeks later. It was short and very clear. "Mr. Vanderberg, I paid a legal price for a legitimate laborer. I have proper documents proving my ownership. The stories about his supposed royal status did not concern me. If the British or Zulu authorities want this man, they can follow proper legal procedures. Until then, he remains my property and works in my fields. Your offer of compensation is refused. Do not contact me again about this matter." Vanderberg read the letter again and again, feeling a deep sense of despair. Deuce did not understand, or refused to understand, the seriousness of the situation. He held tightly to his legal rights without seeing the political storm building around him. In September, the news became worse. Another of Vanderberg's informants, a merchant who regularly traveled between the African coast and the Indian Ocean islands, told him a troubling story. There had been a serious incident at Deuce's plantation. One evening, several laborers had tried to escape. The attempt was violently crushed. 3 men were shot. The others, including the tall Zulu with the ritual scars, were publicly flogged as a warning. But that was not all. After the punishment, while Deuce believed he had restored order, something unusual happened. The Zulu, his back still bleeding from the whip, stood up and spoke, not in begging or anger. He spoke calmly in a mix of Zulu and broken French he had learned. He gave his name, Makanda Ka Senzangakona, son of Senzangakona of the Zulu royal line. He described his capture, his journey, his suffering. He named Vanderberg, and then he spoke words that sounded like a curse or a prophecy. He who sells a king will die without peace. He who chains a prince will see his chains close upon himself. My people are searching for me. They will find me. And on that day, every man who touched my freedom will pay in blood. Deuce, according to the merchant, laughed at his words. He called Makanda mad, a liar, an impostor. But several European witnesses present were struck by the man's dignity and certainty. Some began to question, and if it was true, letters were sent to the colonial authorities in Mauritius. Quiet investigations began, but colonial systems were slow, and Deuce had connections that made things difficult. Vanderberg, hearing this story, felt the weight of guilt fall heavily on him. Makanda was suffering. He was whipped, humiliated, forced into hard labor in the sugarcane fields. And all of this happened because Vanderberg had chosen not to ask questions, had chosen profit over caution. For the first time in his life, Vanderberg began to question whether his actions were truly justified. He had always told himself he was only a middleman, simply facilitating deals that would happen anyway. But now, faced with the real consequences of his actions, he could no longer hide behind those excuses. In October, a British warship arrived at Lorenzo Marx. Its commander, Captain Winslow, had clear orders from London. The Makanda affair had turned into a diplomatic priority. The British government wanted to avoid a conflict with the Zulus, who were already unsettled by other complaints. If Makanda could be found and freed, it would show British goodwill and help ongoing negotiations. Winslow called Vanderberg aboard his ship. The meeting was harsh and direct. Mr. Vanderberg, you are directly responsible for this crisis. Your carelessness, your greed have put relations between the British Empire and a powerful African nation at risk. People could die because of your mistakes. Vanderberg tried to defend himself. I did not know who he was. How could I have known? Winslow cut him short. You should have known. It is your business to know. The marks on his body, his behavior, the way the other captives treated him. Everything showed he was no ordinary prisoner. But you chose to ignore it. What do you want from me now? Vanderberg asked. Facts. Mauritius refuses to cooperate quickly. Deuce insists on his property rights. The French colonial system on the island is slow and corrupt. We need another way. Winslow leaned forward. You will write an official sworn statement admitting that you sold Makanda without properly checking his identity. This statement will be used in legal action in Mauritius to force his release. But that will destroy me, Vanderberg protested. I would publicly admit serious negligence. No one will want to do business with me anymore. That is the least of your worries, Winslow replied coldly. If Makanda dies in captivity, or if a war starts because of this affair, I promise you will be tried and punished. You will spend the rest of your life in prison if you are lucky. If you are not, the Zulus will find a way to reach you, and their justice will be far harsher than that of European courts. Vanderberg had no choice. He wrote the statement and signed it before witnesses. Every word was an admission of his guilt, his carelessness, his moral failure. Winslow left with the document, promising that procedures in Mauritius would be sped up. But he warned Vanderberg, do not leave Lorenzo Marx. You might be called to testify, and if you disappear, I will find you." After the British ship departed, Manderberg remained alone in his warehouse. For the first time in years, he truly looked around him. The cells where so many people had been locked up, the chains hanging on the walls, the bloodstains on the floor that no cleaning could fully remove. All this he had created. All this was the result of his choices. Santos found him sitting in his office, staring into nothing. "Boss, we received a message. Zulu warriors are less than 100 kilometers from the northern border. They are moving toward the coast." Vanderberg looked up. "How many are there?" "Rumors say 50, maybe 100 warriors. These are not regular soldiers. They are scouts, trackers. They are searching for something or someone." Vanderberg understood. Even if Makanda was in Mauritius, the warriors were still searching for those responsible for his capture and sale. They wanted names. They wanted the guilty. And his name, Willem Vanderberg, was written in the ledgers, whispered in the ports, known to all who had taken part in this cursed deal. November 1847. 8 months after the fatal sale, several events came together at once. In Mauritius, British diplomatic pressure finally worked. A colonial judge, under direct pressure from the governor, ordered an official inquiry into the status of the man known as worker number 87 on Duza's plantation. Witnesses were called, experts in African cultures were consulted, and Makanda's ritual scars were consulted, and Makanda's ritual scars were examined and compared with descriptions of royal Zulu markings. The hearing itself became an important event in the colonial history of Mauritius. Makanda was brought to court in chains, but even in that condition, his presence commanded respect. Several European observers wrote in their diaries that they had never seen a captive man wear chains with such dignity. When asked to identify himself, he did so in slow but clear French, reciting his full family line going back 4 generations of Zulu kings. A British anthropologist called as an expert witness examined the scars and confirmed that they matched exactly the ritual patterns reserved for the sons of kings in Zulu tradition. These marks, he explained to the court, were made during sacred ceremonies and could only be worn by those of royal blood. Any attempt to copy them was punished by death in Zulu society. An impostor would never dare wear such marks. Duza tried desperately to defend his position. He presented his purchase papers, arguing that he had acted in good faith, that he had no way of knowing the man's true identity. But the judge did not bend. The verdict was clear. The man was indeed who he claimed to be, Makanda Ka Senzanga Kona, younger son of the former Zulu king, half-brother of the current king. His capture and sale were illegal even under colonial laws that allowed slavery under certain limits. A recognized member of a royal family could not be legally enslaved, as this would be seen as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. Duza was forced to release Makanda immediately and pay a heavy fine to the colonial government. But what struck observers most was the moment Makanda's chains were removed. He stood up slowly, rubbed his wrists, marked by months of iron, and looked Duza directly in the eyes. He said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than words. Duza, according to several accounts, turned pale and left the courtroom shaking. Makanda was handed over to the British authorities, who arranged his return to Zulu territory with full respect for his rank. He was given proper clothing, good food, and comfortable quarters while his journey home was prepared. British officials came to offer their formal apologies for the injustice he had suffered. Makanda listened politely, but kept a cold distance. He accepted their apologies not for himself, but to prevent a war that his people could not afford at that time. But the damage had already been done. Makanda had spent 8 months in captivity. 8 months where every day he had cut cane under the burning sun, where every night he had slept chained on a hard earthen floor, where every night he had slept chained on a hard earthen floor, where every week he had watched others die from exhaustion or disease. He had been chained, beaten, forced into harsh labor, treated as less than human. The physical scars would heal with time, the marks of the whip on his back would fade, but the wounds in his mind would remain forever. And when he returned home, He would carry with him a story of humiliation and injustice that would echo across the Zulu kingdom for many years. In Lorenzo Marques, Van der Berg lived in constant fear that slowly damaged his health and his mind. He slept little, jumped at every sound, and saw danger in every shadow. The Zulu warriors kept getting closer. Each week brought new troubling reports. Informants said they had questioned several merchants with brutal skill, that they had found Ferre's trail somewhere inland near the Natal border. Ferre's body was found by travelers a week later, tied to a tree in the bush. He showed signs of careful torture. His fingers had been broken one by one. His eyes had been taken out. Before dying in pain, he had clearly spoken, giving names, revealing everything he knew about Makanda's capture and sale. The Zulu warriors did not kill for pleasure, but they had ways of forcing the truth from those who had wronged their prince. Van der Berg's name must have been fixed in their minds, now spoken by Ferre before his death. Joe Santos, loyal to the end, advised Van der Berg to leave at once, to flee south toward the Cape Colony, where European protection was stronger, where authorities could protect him from Zulu revenge. But Van der Berg still hesitated, frozen by indecision. Running away would mean leaving his business, his home, everything he had built over 20 years. And where could he go where his reputation would not follow him? News spread quickly in the colonies. His name was already spoken in the drawing rooms of Cape Town and in the taverns of the port, always with the same mix of dark curiosity and moral disgust. He told himself he was safe here, protected by Portuguese authorities, guarded inside his strong warehouse. He told himself the Zulus would not dare attack a European site in a colonial city, but deep inside he knew it was a lie. The warriors searching for Makanda were not regular soldiers following orders. They were men bound by blood and honor, ready to die to avenge their prince. Colonial borders and political protection meant nothing to them. The decision was made for him. One night in mid-November, under a sky without a moon, Van der Berg was woken by sounds in the street. First voices shouting in Portuguese, the voices of guards patrolling the port, then gunfire, then a deep silence more frightening than any noise. He rushed to his window and saw flames rising from his warehouse. Not an accident, but a planned fire set in several places at once to ensure total destruction. In the orange moving light, he saw shadows moving with perfect control. Tall men, their skin shining with sweat and the heat of the flames, moving with deadly precision. Zulu warriors. Van der Berg felt his blood turn cold. They had come. After months of careful tracking, they had finally found the place, and the man they were searching for. He counted at least a dozen shadows, maybe more, moving around the burning warehouse like figures in some old ritual. He dressed quickly with shaking hands, grabbed his loaded pistol and the pouch of gold he always kept near his bed for emergencies, and slipped out into the night through the back door of his house. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp smell of burning wood. The warehouse burned fiercely, flames rising more than 10 m high, throwing flickering shadows onto nearby buildings. The guards he had hired were all dead, killed quickly and quietly before any alarm could be raised. Their bodies lay in twisted positions, throats cut with a single clean strike. Van der Berg recognized Joe Santos among the dead, his loyal foreman who had tried to defend him to the very end. A wave of guilt hit him, but he had no time to stop. He ran toward the port, hoping to find a boat, any boat ready to leave at once. His lungs burned, his heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Behind him, he could hear the warriors, not chasing him directly yet, but carefully destroying everything that carried his name. All the ledgers, all the records that proved his life and his trade. The port was half asleep at that hour. A few drunken sailors stumbled along the docks. A Portuguese merchant ship was moored, seemingly ready to sail with the morning tide. Van der Berg rushed toward the gangway. "I must leave now, tonight." The captain, a rough man named Mendes, looked at him with doubt. "We leave at dawn, not before. We are waiting for the tide. I'll pay double, triple." Van der Berg pulled out his gold pouch, and emptied it onto the deck. The coins rolled and clinked in the night. Mendes saw the glow of flames from the warehouse district, heard distant shouting, understood that something serious was happening. But the gold shone brightly in the lantern light. "Come aboard, but we leave in an hour at the earliest. Impossible to navigate now. The port exit is too dangerous without light." Vanderberg climbed aboard, hid in a cabin, his loaded pistol resting on his knees. The hour of waiting felt like the longest of his life. Every minute stretched endlessly. He heard the crew moving on deck, urgently preparing to depart. He also heard, carried by the wind, the sounds of destruction continuing in his district. At last, the ship began to move, slowly pulling away from the quay. Vanderberg went up on deck, unable to stay below any longer. In the first pale light of dawn, he turned to look at Lorenzo Marquez one last time. His warehouse was nothing but a blackened frame, smoking beams collapsing inward. His house had also been burned to the ground. 20 years of work, reduced to ash and ruin. But more than that, it was his whole life that was burning. His reputation, his identity, his sense of self. Everything was swallowed by those flames. On the quay, he caught a final sight that would haunt him forever. A group of figures stood still, watching the ship drift away. Even from that distance, he could feel the weight of their stare, the cold patience of their anger. They had not caught him that night, but their message was clear. They knew who he was. They knew where he was going, and their memory would not fade. The ship left the port as the sun rose over the horizon. Vanderberg stayed on deck, watching Lorenzo Marquez fade into the morning mist. He knew he would never return, and he also knew that no matter where he went, a part of him would always remain there, burning forever in the flames of his own deeds. Vanderberg reached the Cape Colony in December 1847. The journey had lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which he barely slept, waking at the slightest sound on the ship, convinced that somehow the Zulu warriors would find him even at sea. He stepped off the ship a broken man, aged 10 years in just a few months. His hair was almost completely white, his hands constantly shaking. He first stayed in a miserable boarding house in the port district of Cape Town under the false name of William Johnson, presenting himself as a former accountant who had fallen on hard times. He could not use his real letters of credit, as they carried his true name and would expose him. He lived on the gold he had managed to bring, stretching it by living poorly in a small room that smelled of mold and sea air. For the first few weeks, he hardly went outside. He sat by his window, watching the street, searching for figures that might be disguised Zulu warriors. Every tall, dark-skinned man made him uneasy. He startled at every knock on his door. He slept with his pistol under his pillow and still suffered terrible nightmares. In his dreams, he saw Makanda standing in the flames of the warehouse, looking at him with that frightening calm, repeating again and again, "He who sells a king will die without peace." But the past followed him in more real ways, too. His from newspapers circulating in the colonies that Makanda had been freed and returned with honor. The British had arranged a formal ceremony in Durban, where Makanda had been officially given back to his people. The British governor himself had offered public apologies. The newspapers described Makanda as calm and dignified, accepting the apologies with the grace of a true prince. The matter had been officially closed, diplomatic relations preserved. But, for Vanderberg, nothing was truly finished. The warriors who had burned his warehouse had not been sent by the king or any official authority. They were Makanda's loyal followers, men who had sworn personal loyalty to him, acting on their own to avenge their prince's honor. These men did not follow treaties or political decisions. They followed an older, stricter code, and their memory lasted for generations. After a few months, when his gold began to run dangerously low, Vanderberg was forced to look for work. He found a job as an accountant in a small textile business, far from the trading world where his real name might be recognized. He worked long hours for little pay, living in a level of poverty that would have been unthinkable just months earlier when he had been a wealthy merchant. He moved several times over the years, changing his name each time. from William Johnson to Peter Decker to Hendrik Bosman. Each time he began to feel a bit safer, began to believe he had escaped his past, something would happen that brought his fear back. Once, he saw a man in the street who looked like one of the guards who had worked for him in Lorenzo Marquez. The man did not recognize him, or pretended not to, but Van der Berg panicked and left the city at once, abandoning his job and few belongings. Another time, in a tavern, he overheard sailors speaking about rumors that Zulu Avengers were still tracking certain chants involved in the captured prince's case. The stories were likely exaggerated, shaped by drink and imagination, but they were enough to terrify Vanderberg. He did not sleep for 3 nights, convinced that every sound in the dark signaled the arrival of his hunters. He never returned to the slave trade. The very thought of it had become unbearable to him. Sometimes, during those sleepless nights, he remembered all the faces of the hundreds, maybe thousands of people who had passed through his warehouse over the years, all those human beings reduced to entries in a book, to prices on paper. He saw their eyes, heard their quiet cries, felt the weight of their suffering, and among all those faces, Makanda always stood out, calm and certain, looking at him with silent judgment. He once tried to write a letter to Makanda, a weak attempt to apologize, to explain, maybe even to ask for forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. He spent hours writing and rewriting, searching for the right words. But in the end, he tore it apart and threw it into the fire. What could he possibly say? How could anyone apologize for enslaving a prince? Some actions could never be undone. In 1853, 6 years after the events that had destroyed his life, Vanderberg lived in a small boarding house outside Cape Town, in a coastal village whose name he had already forgotten. He worked as a clerk for a local lawyer, a dull job that required copying legal papers for hours. He was 60 years old, but looked 20 years older. His hair was fully white, his face deeply lined, his hands always shaking with a nervous tremor. No doctor could cure. Years of constant fear had worn down his health. He suffered from frequent heart palpitations, chronic sleeplessness, and chest pains that sometimes left him struggling to breathe. The doctors told him to rest, to get fresh air, to worry less. But how could he rest when every night brought the same dreams? How could he stop worrying when he knew that somewhere men still remembered what he had done? On November 23rd, 1853, exactly 6 years after the night his warehouse had burned, Vanderberg returned to his room after a long and tiring day of work. He felt especially exhausted that evening, a deep tiredness that seemed to come from his bones. He prepared a simple meal, tried to read a newspaper by candlelight, but the words blurred before his eyes. He went to bed early, hoping for once to sleep peacefully, but around midnight he woke to a sound in his room. Someone had opened his door despite the lock he always checked, 3 times before sleeping. In the darkness he saw a shape, a tall man moving with a quiet grace that felt terribly familiar. Vanderberg wanted to shout, to reach for his pistol, but a strange paralysis held him still. His heart pounded so hard he thought it would burst from his chest. The man stepped closer and lit the candle beside the bed. In the shaking light, Vanderberg saw his face. It was Makanda. 6 years later, the Zulu prince stood inside his room. He wore European travel clothes, but around his neck hung traditional Zulu bead necklaces. His face looked more marked than before, with deep lines shaping his mouth and eyes. But his eyes themselves had not changed. That same calm, patient, and steady gaze remained. "You recognized me," Makanda said in French, his accent present but his words clear. "Good. I wanted you to know who I was." Vanderberg tried to speak, but no sound came from his throat. Makanda sat quietly on the room's single chair, as if he were paying a normal social visit. "I was freed almost 6 years ago. I returned to my place among my people. I helped negotiate with the British to protect my kingdom from their ambitions. My life moved on." He paused, his eyes never leaving Vanderberg. "I never forgot the 8 months I spent in the sugarcane fields, The lashings, the chains, the humiliation of seeing my people treated like goods. And I never forgot your name, Willem Vanderberg. Vanderberg finally found his voice, barely a whisper. I didn't know who you were. Makanda slowly shook his head. No, you didn't know. But would you have acted differently if you had known? Or would you have simply asked for a higher price? The silence that followed felt like a judgment. My warriors wanted to kill you that night. In Lorenzo Mark, Makanda continued. They had the right. You had sold their prince. In our law, that is a crime punishable by death. But I told them to spare you. Do you know why? Vanderberg shook his head, unable to speak. Because I wanted you to live with what you had done. Death would have been too quick, too easy. I wanted you to spend the rest of your days looking over your shoulder, startled by every shadow, wondering when your debt would be claimed. And that is what you have done, isn't it? Makanda stood, then walked toward the bed. Vanderberg felt his heart race faster, the pain in his chest becoming unbearable. I will not kill you, Willem Vanderberg. I will not even touch you. But I wanted you to know that I came, that I found you, that despite all your name changes, all your movements, all your precautions, you could not escape. A man cannot escape what he has done. He walked toward the door, then turned back. One last time. Sleep now, if you can. Your heart will not last much longer anyway. I can see it. You are already dying from your own fear and your own guilt. That is a more perfect justice than anything I could give you. He left as quietly as he had entered, closing the door behind him. Vanderberg lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the pain in his chest spreading into his left arm. He knew what this meant. His heart was failing. But strangely, he no longer felt fear. Only a deep tiredness, almost a sense of relief. It was over. The endless running, the constant worry, all of it was coming to an end. He closed his eyes. His final thought was of all the faces in his warehouse, all the lives he had shattered. He wondered if somewhere, in some idea of universal justice, there would be a place where he would have to answer for his actions. He almost hoped there would be. The next morning, the boarding house owner found him dead in his bed. The doctor who examined the body noted in his report, heart failure, likely caused by long-term nervous exhaustion and extended stress. The subject showed clear signs of chronic anxiety, but the owner, when questioned, mentioned something unusual. The previous evening, she had seen a tall, dark-skinned, well-dressed man enter the boarding house. He had asked which room Mr. Bossman occupied. She had pointed it out, assuming he was a friend or business associate. The man stayed for about an hour, and then left without saying a word. The next morning, Mr. Bossman was dead. Was there a connection? The colonial authorities saw no reason to carry out a full investigation. An unimportant man living under a false name had died of what seemed like natural causes. Nothing worth special attention in a colony where people died every day for countless reasons. His body was buried in an unmarked cemetery on the outskirts of the city under the name Hendrik Bossman. No tombstone was placed. No ceremony was held. A few co-workers attended the funeral out of duty, but none of them cried. How could anyone mourn a man no one truly knew? The real Vanderberg disappeared from history, taking his secrets and guilt with him. The authorities never connected the respectable merchant of Lorenzo Marquez with the lonely clerk who died quietly in Cape Town. As for Makanda, he returned to his kingdom and lived for another 23 years after his release. He became an important and respected advisor to his half-brother the king, playing a key role in difficult negotiations with British colonial powers during the tense years before the Anglo-Zulu Wars. His time in captivity had given him a deep understanding of the European mindset, their strength, but also their weaknesses, their moral contradictions, and their internal conflicts. This knowledge, paid for through great suffering, served his people well in the years that followed. Yet he never spoke openly about his experience as a slave. It was a secret he guarded carefully, shared only with his most trusted warriors and a few close family members. He allowed stories and legends to grow around this dark period of his life, knowing that sometimes mystery could be stronger than the full truth. Some said he had forgiven his captors, following traditions of reconciliation and Ubuntu within his culture. Others whispered that he had personally tracked down every man involved in his capture and sale, carrying out a silent and careful revenge that left no trace. The truth, as often in history, remained uncertain, hidden behind layers of stories and time. But those who knew Makanda personally said that after his return, something in him had changed. There was a new hardness in his eyes when dealing with Europeans, a cold determination in his voice when speaking about protecting his people's independence. The humiliation he had suffered had not broken him. It had shaped him like steel in fire, making him stronger, but also less willing to bend, less open to compromise. Vanderberg's ledgers, those that survived the fire in his warehouse, were taken by British authorities during their early investigation. They were placed in Colonial archives in London, where they still remain today in dusty boxes, rarely opened. These documents provide a detailed and disturbing record of a trade that reduced human lives to simple entries in a ledger, to numbers, prices, and dates. For historians who have studied them, they offer a rare insight into the cold administrative systems of slavery, the ordinary nature of great cruelty. A British researcher in 1923, more than 70 years after the events, came across these records by chance while studying colonial relations with the Zulu kingdom. He found the entry concerning Makanda, noted the details of the transaction, and began to rebuild the full story by comparing the ledgers with other documents and testimonies. His academic article, published in a little-known colonial history journal, was mostly ignored at the time, but it planted a seed. Later historians rediscovered the story and expanded on it. Some saw it as a simple business mistake with large consequences, an example of the dangers of the slave trade, even for those who profited from it. Others viewed it as a strong symbol of colonial arrogance and its limits, proof that even the most organized systems of oppression carry the seeds of their own downfall. A few historians, especially from Africa, suggested that this event, though not widely known, may have influenced British colonial policies toward African kingdoms in later years, making them more cautious and more aware that Africans were not just victims, but political forces who had to be respected in negotiations. But beyond historical studies and academic debate, the story of William van Darrenberg and Makanda remains deeply human. It is the story of a man who believed he could turn earth-bearing human beings into simple property, who thought his careful records and organized systems would protect him from the moral weight of his actions, and who realized too late that some people carry a dignity and power that cannot be measured in gold or written in ledgers. It is a story of justice, whether shared or personal, of revenge, that can take many forms, or perhaps of an unavoidable fate that catches those who think they can escape what they have done. It is also the story of a prince who was chained but never broken, who survived deep humiliation and returned not only whole but stronger, playing an important role in protecting his people during the rise of European colonial expansion. And it is also the story of the thousands of other captives who passed through Van Derberg's warehouse, whose names were never recorded in newspapers, whose suffering never caused political concern, whose lives were lost in silence and forgotten over time. Each of them had a story, a family, a life full of meaning. But only Makanda, by chance of his royal birth, was noticed, searched for, and freed. The others remained in the shadows of history, their voices lost to time and indifference. In Zulu villages, even today, the story of Makanda is sometimes told, the prince who was sold into slavery and returned. The details change depending on the storyteller, the place, and the generation. Some versions add dramatic elements, turning his return into a heroic legend. Others stay closer to historical facts, focusing on the political and diplomatic side of the story. But all these versions, whether simple or elaborate, share one central message, a truth that goes beyond details. This message is clear and powerful. Even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, Human dignity can survive. Even in chains, a king remains a king in his mind and heart. Oppression can break bodies, but it cannot always break the spirit. And those who forget this truth, those who treat people as objects without value, do so at their own risk. Sooner or later, in one way or another, justice finds a path. Sometimes it comes through law and courts. Sometimes it arrives in the form of warriors moving silently in the night. And sometimes, perhaps it comes from within, in the form of deep guilt that slowly consumes a man until his own heart fails under its weight. So do you believe everything has been revealed in this story? Do you think Van der Berg died of natural causes, worn down by his own fear and guilt? Or do you believe Makunda took his final revenge in a way that colonial doctors could never understand or detect?